What I'm going to talk about looks like a talk on Deleuze, but it's not. I'm just using Deleuze to give me some vague vocabulary or methodology. For a broad point, I want to make about two conceptions of history, and one would be broadly Marxist, capitalist, and that would amount to a negative universal history, which in short would mean by the time we get to capitalism, it's possible to realise that that's what was going to happen all along, that capitalism gives us the possibility of reading all other social structures leading up to capitalism as moments of economic social formation. That's concept one. But as the title of my talk is Anthropos trumps capitalism, the concept of history I want to work towards is stratigraphic, in which that notion that arriving at capitalism gives us the possibility of reading, understanding where the past was going. The stratigraphic conception would delimit that, give us a broader conception of what would amount to, here's my claim, that the human is an effect of temporal amplitude. And what I mean by that is what counts as human is an effect of how great our temporal range is. So to put it briefly, if we think of the human as the type of beings we are now, then it's likely that humanity ends very soon, given our dependence on hyperconsumption. But if we have a broader conception of the human that goes beyond capitalism, then the end of us would not be the end of humanity. Okay, so the Anthropocene is a spatial temporal notion. A strata discloses that a certain composition took place. Anthropos then names that event, where a series of differences, biomass, radiation, CO2 levels, is attributed to a species. Not only does an event in the spatial present then pose the question of the who and when of this event, so there's that something took place, then we can ask who and when. That also produces a configuration of the now. From an arrangement in space, one can discern layers of time, all appearing in the present as that which composes the current strata of where we are now. So the space of the present produces a new we. There might be futural implications to this layering, limits to what we can do, indications of tendencies. But my key point is stratigraphy is not temporality, and certainly not a line or arrow of time. That's what marks its value, I would suggest. It's a marker, but doesn't give us a temporality. It gives us layers. It's the past inscribed in the present. It may compose a we, and perhaps even a debt, a sense of who has produced a composition that will now, and into the future, create injustice. Here's my question. What happens if this composition is a dead end? If the markers of catastrophe are so intense that the we that it composes is already over. So we look and see this thing that was the human and that its time is done. I want to suggest that this is the case in several senses. So catastrophic is this perceived strata that the we it marks appears as unsustainable. Second, so extra-human are the effects of this anthropos, that the notion of an agent of history is too weak to cover the human relation to its milieu. And so disastrous is the indicated future, that the human is facing its end in a quite literal sense. What does it mean to be this we that faces an end? This human that is not given as a natural kind, it's not our species being, but as an inscription. It's what has happened. I want to suggest that the stratigraphy of the Anthropocene is best thought of existentially rather than naturally. The effect of recognising the human as a geological event may at first appear to create a new negative universal history where we are all in this now common predicament facing a future. That's one possibility, but what I want to argue is that that existential event of looking at the human that has been places the human within inhuman time, and that is its value. Now here's where I talk a little bit about Deleuze and Guattari, but I do so to mark a contrast between two models of history, which aren't limited to them, right? They're just examples of two models of history. And I contrast 1,000 Plateaus with Anti-Oedipus. So I see Anti-Oedipus as Marxist, Kantian, almost Hegelian, universal history. By the time you arrive at capitalism, it's possible to see all other social formations as leading up to that point. That's Anti-Oedipus. And then 1,000 Plateaus, a different model of history, which is stratigraphy, so the language of strata, that creates a new sense of the human, not that which at the end of history can recognise itself as the contingent outcome of a series of social formations, but an event marked within time. So following a Kantian critical structure, Anti-Oedipus moves through primitive, despotic and capitalist formations where capitalism, as the free flow of forces without centre or ground, appears finally as that which had always been warded off by other social machines. I refer to this structure as Kantian and critical, not just because of the terminology hijacked by Deleuze and Guattari, where they use the language of synthesis, although it's now among bodies, not within the subject, but also, and this is goes again beyond their work, a post-metaphysical philosophical maturity. By the time you arrive at the end of history, it's possible to see where history was going all along, even if where you are is not inevitable, but it gives you a way of reading the past. It's only after capitalism that one might recognise the formation of territories as made possible by forms of exchange, recognise despotism as the production of power by way of seizing controls of surplus, and then see capitalism finally as nothing more than the production of social forms as relations without ground or sovereign order. Even if money reterritorialises relations into a single form of quantification, money is, like all the other social forms that Deleuze and Guattari analysed in Anti-Oedipus, a way of impeding, managing, giving an axiom to exchange. There's nothing necessary or inevitable about capitalism, and yet once capitalism has arrived, one can see that it always haunted social systems. What appears in capitalism as the free flow of forces and relations that enter into relation to produce social structures was the very condition that had made all other social machines possible. As a side note, which is maybe more than a side note, I want to compare this to Graeber and Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, which also charts multiple social forms and the ongoing strategies deployed to avoid the state form. So what I see Graeber and Wengrow, and to a great extent Deleuze and Guattari doing in Anti-Oedipus, is see, yes, from the point of view of capital, it's possible to read the rationale of all these other social forms, but to read them not as inevitably moving towards capitalism, but constantly working to avoid capitalism. There are all these different ways in which capitalism or state power was haunting social forms, and there were various strategies deployed to resist that centralisation of power. It's because state forms hover in the background that history might be thought of less as a march towards global recognition in which we are all human by way of a single cultural exchange, then a series of creative strategies for warding off state power. So maybe to refer to the opening remarks, the human, or this universal we, rather than something we're moving towards, is something that social forms try and avoid, right? So that it's the creation of like arbitrary, like if you like tribal differences that are there to ward off that centralisation of recognition. So it's, to return to Anti-Oedipus, it's after the advent of the state that one might read social forms as struggling to arrive at a sense of humanity in general. So that would be, I think, not only liberalism, but actually a lot of forms of post-structuralism, including Derridean deconstruction. Like humanity is this presupposed we that always remains in the future as an ideal that we can never achieve or arrive at. That's possibility one, where humanity becomes this virtual object of the future. What I want to suggest is that from Deleuze's early work up until his work with Guattari in Thousand Plateaus and What is Philosophy, humanity is a virtual object of the past. It's something that it's always haunting and orienting social forms, but gets constantly, to use their terminology, or the translation of their terminology, warded off. So, coming back to the Anthropocene. I think that the Anthropocene prompts just this type of both mobilisation and question of the human. Possibility one, there's a we that would be unified by a capacity for cultural formation, each one of us forming our worlds in our own way, ultimately recognising each other as self-forming agents. This could allow for recognising the common planetary predicament of the future, even if the various modes of existing and being human that make up planetary life contribute and suffer in very different ways to what has come to be called the Anthropocene. We would maintain Anthropos, not Capitalism or white supremacy or Plantationocene or the other scenes. We would maintain Anthropos not because of some natural species kind in the past, but because of a now shared future. And because Anthropos might cover all this capacity for living, thinking, existing differently. Now, something that's possibility one, and I see that as I've already said, something like deconstruction, which wants to make the future virtual, already to come, forms of liberalism, and more concretely within, can we call it Anthropocene studies, Depeche Chakraborty's notion of negative universal history. There may have been different worlds leading up to this present, but we're now all in the same boat, or as he argues, there's no lifeboats for the rich. Although there are plenty of lifeboats for the rich. That's just the way it is. I mean, that's what's happening now. There are lifeboats for the rich. Okay, so what I want to suggest to contrast with that, I am using the language of Deleuze and Guattari, but I think this goes well beyond their work. There's something different going on in Anti-Oedipus, and I choose that because I think part of the rubric and problematic of this conference is post-Marxist. We know that that capitalism and the human are intertwined, and that questioning that interconnection requires a genealogy and a geology. So one might think of Anti-Oedipus as a genealogy of this formalism. How is it that the human or the subject appears as at the end of history as that which created all these many worlds? Anti-Oedipus gives a historical answer. That is, it's with capitalism and privatisation. That something like the subject is formed, who can then be seen as the basic social unit from which social formations unfold. The formation of the human as the subject comes about with capitalism as a psychic formation, a social production of the psyche. I could say more about that, but I won't. One might contrast broadly and crudely the Oedipal subject, or the privatised subject, whose relation to the world begins from the basic unit of the person. And this would be as true of neoliberalism as it would be for a climate and geopolitical politics that manages our future, always referring back to the subject that we are. So I see the key point, this is not original, of Anti-Oedipus as being about capitalism. Yes, it's an economic history, but it's also the history of privatisation. It's that history of privatisation that produces a limited temporality of the human, what counts as the human. So here's where I turn from Anti-Oedipus and its historical argument that towards the stratigraphic argument of 1,000 plateaus. A geology, rather than a genealogy, produces, instead of this line of social formations leading up to capitalism, which can turn back and recognise the past, it produces a series of imminent infinites from various social formations and non-human formations. There are different ways in which one can grasp the whole. The infinite unfolds differently from each point in the open whole of various strata. It's from a fragment that one can read the whole, but the whole differs depending on which fragment from which it unfolds. If I use the word fragment here, it's to draw a contrast between Deleuze and Guattari's Leibnizian orientation to an open whole versus Kantian, Marxist, Hegelian. So rather than say, from where I am, it is possible to imagine a whole that is never given, that's what I see as Kantian, Marxist, Hegelian. From the given, there is a necessary but impossible orientation or idea. It's from the fragment that one assumes there must have been a totality. And that's possibility one. Possibility two is that each fragment creates an orientation to the whole that is at odds with all the others. What does this mean concretely? I guess, again, referring to the opening remarks, we're in the humanities, and even among different disciplines, that gives us different temporal timeframes and different recognitions of what counts as the human or what counts as who we are. And I would suggest that the task of the humanities in facing capitalism and the human should be not to solve the problem of capitalism and the human, but to multiply it, to create different temporalities or fragments from which different possibilities and timelines unfold. Put in more concrete and political terms, I would suggest, along the line argued for by Bernard Stiegler, that the human is a specifically technical and temporal problem. It's a technical and temporal problem. It's a problem of the ways in which we read and open out to the past. And that capitalism is an aspect of that temporal technical problem. And that the critique of capitalism ought to become a techniques of time. That is, at what point do we cease to be who we are? At what point does hyperconsumption define who we are? And at what point does abandoning hyperconsumption, exploitation, require a new sense of the human? So a philosophy and a critique of capitalism that is anti-Oedipal would not begin with the basic unit of the psyche, but would both undertake a genealogy of ways in which the human becomes a private subject and question then how something like Anthropos emerges as both this seemingly inevitable humanity threatened with extinction and as a being with a counter-history that might be otherwise. This is the third sort of concluding part of what I want to talk about. And again, it seems, this is me constantly defending my Deleuze attachments, right? And this is what, I guess what I'm getting at is we are the effect of certain attachments, and we've got to let go of certain attachments, and here's me incapable of letting go of my attachment to Deleuze. But I wanted to draw attention to, or pick up from, a moment in Difference and Repetition, which when I reread it recently, every time you reread it, it becomes a different book. The whole book became a question of the inevitability of who we are and how we might challenge the inevitability of who we are. And particularly throughout, concepts of destiny. Concepts of destiny. There's a moment in Difference and Repetition where Deleuze defines destiny. I'm going to read out from it and then draw some implications from that. This is me quoting from the translation from Difference and Repetition. Destiny never consists in step-by-step deterministic relations between presents which succeed one another according to the order of a represented time. Rather, it implies between successive presents non-localisable connections, actions at a distance, systems of replay, resonance and echoes, objective chances, signs, signals and roles which transcend spatial locations and temporal successions. ... editing out a little bit. This is why destiny accords so badly with determinism, but so well with freedom. That's the bit I wanted to draw upon. Destiny accords so badly with determinism, but so well with freedom. Deleuze writes this in a broader section on Bergson's conception of a pure past and Nietzsche's concept of eternal return. It seems very abstract until that line about freedom. This is why destiny accords so badly with determinism, but so well with freedom. Freedom lies in choosing the levels. So if one is attached to a narrow form of history in which the human is at the end of a history of capitalism, one is doomed. Right? It's coming to an end, one is already dead. If one expands one's temporal range, if the human is a fragment within a time that's broader than what we recognise, then freedom opens up. We know surely, that human existence will come to an end. That's even without climate change, right? There's some point in time, cosmic time, geological time, when humans will come to an end, just as we know someday that we die. Right? The difference between personal death, I die someday, and humans dying someday, is that when I die, it's fairly clear who I am. I am this bounded individual. But when humanity dies, it's not clear what would count as the death of humanity. Is it the death of capitalism? Is it the death of state societies? Is it, as so much post-apocalyptic culture, the end of the world is actually the end of capitalism? The problem is how we deal with a rupture in that notion of someday, and more importantly, who we are. To know that one's own body dies at some point has a clearer temporal range than the death of humanity. We don't mean, when we talk about the end of humanity or the end of the world, for the most part, we don't mean the species so much as what I want to refer to as a virtual object. Humanity is a virtual object. It's not what we are, but what we always ought to become or will become. When we talk about things not being human or being inhuman, or when politicians say, this is not who we are, when it's obviously who we are, humanity is a virtual object, always lost and in search of being regained. When we talk about saving humanity, we're not talking about what we have been, for the most part, because what we have been is probably not something worthy of saving, given that it includes genocide, slavery, Holocaust, climate change, global injustice, barbarism. When we speak about the Anthropocene, this actual object, the humanity that is discernible in the Earth strata, it's possible because of the virtual humanity, or the sense of who we are, that has been secured through globalism, imperialism, and that is always about to be lost. So quite literally, when geologists look at a strata and say, yes, this is us, that's only possible because an us and a we, a global humanity, has been produced both materially through globalism and capitalism, and virtually through the imaginations of who we are that make that possible and are made possible by it. The pure past is this we that comes into being with every discussion of the human. It's always already gone, always already lost, always seeking to be regained. And it's this pure past, this sense of all that is as already having been, that I would argue can generate an ethics of a post-capitalist ethics of the Anthropocene, or a post-capitalist ethics of the post-Anthropocene, because you should throw in a few more posts, because I don't want to be attached to any of those words. So the attachment to who we are is an effect of time and techniques. The relation to a virtual object that produces a we that has been promised by the past and into the future, but that we has already gone. The present, the we of the Anthropocene, is both the actual species, but that real object is made possible by the virtuality of humanity that appears as if for all time. It's after it's having been that we recognise it as there everywhere. That's, if you like, the Marxist capitalist notion. But what the stratigraphic notion gives us is that humanity has already gone. Like, we can read it as having passed, which would place us somewhere else. Expanding our temporalception and by way of techniques would generate a freedom of, I'm going to use the language of Deleuze and Guattari, becoming imperceptible, not recognising who we are. Humanity would not be the present, because humanity is never the present, it's a virtual object. It is currently an us defined by privatisation and a complete unfreedom in facing destiny. If we are nothing more than our attachments to privatisation and private consumption, then we are massively unfree, not just because of current political unfreedoms, but because we are unsustainable, we're doomed. The only humanity towards which we are currently oriented is massively contracted. I'm actually going to finish by quoting a writer from another pandemic, Mary Shelley, in The Last Man, just as an example of what I want to talk about, this ethics of having been, or this ethics of humanity as a virtual object. Writing about a global pandemic that erases most of humanity except for one last man, Mary Shelley begins that novel by travelling through Italy in 1815 and stumbling upon a cave. So it's 1815, you stumble upon a cave in which there's leaves. It turns out to be the Sibyl's Cave. And on each leaf is written a fragment of the history of humanity, including, oh, look, the Punic Wars, the French Revolution, so on. Right? So and oh, look, there's 2100 when humanity ends. So it's 1815, and there's this cave in which, oh, look, there's that point at which we end. And each one is on a separate leaf. The novel turns out to be just written on one leaf, right? This is the person in 2100 narrating how we die. That's the beginning of the book. The book begins with humans having ended. There's the cave. Not only is that moment in that 1826 novel an allegory of where we are now, right, where each leaf is the IPCC telling us when we're going to end, right? There's various years, 2040, 2050, ending. So it depends which leaf we pick up at which point we end. What are the ethics of facing that end? In Mary Shelley ends the novel with abandoning a politics of futurity in which we try and seize the future, keep going as we are, and instead the final character in the novel is accompanied by his dog, which is a form of, there's a cynical, stoic ethic at the end. How would one live without attachments to the future? How in 2022 can humanity justify going on, and how can humanity imagine going on? Except that who we are now has always ended, that what might become is given in a humanity that is elsewhere. This differs temporally and technically from liberalism. It's not that humanity bears a future irreducible to what it has been. That's what I'm arguing is not just liberalism, but some forms of deconstruction, but probably most forms of humanism. It's not that humanity bears a future irreducible to what it has been. Rather, it's that one might live this humanity as something already gone, already absent, missing and past. Nothing that exists now, none of the attachments that produce who we are has to be. How might we think of ourselves in the absence of who we are? Just to really finish. I think this has quite concrete implications, and I'm just going to name two. I just finished reading Jonathan Crairy's Scorched Earth, which reads like a grumpy old man who hates the internet, right? But it does, which it is, right? It is a grumpy old man that hates the internet, but partly is this can't go on, right? This is, and not for reasons of, there's political reasons, as in the internet takes political movements and privatises them. That's his political critique. But there's also a materialist critique. The internet and its forms of hyperconsumption is materially unsustainable. Hence Scorched Earth. How might we live? Saying goodbye to that is a big goodbye, right? Like how one would live without that. That's a sort of negative, apocalyptic, concrete conception of saying goodbye to who we are. But I also think Graeber and Wengrow's History of Humanity, and I know there have been lots of empirical disputes with their History of Humanity, but as a thought experiment, imagine all other social forms as trying to avoid becoming who we are, right? So that I see that as an imaginative exercise. Not necessarily a global and universal sense of who we are, so much as the sense of a fragmented being that might always not be. Thank you.